Once again, I will push back against UFO culture echo chamber. In my last video, titled, Lou Elizondo, Are UFOs Piloted by Advanced Animals?, I pushed back against the assumption that what's behind UFOs is purely spiritual, and contrasted that idea with the potential reality that we're really just dealing with animals that are more advanced than we are. I didn't suggest where they come from, but that video that I recently published is predicated on the idea that any biology that emerges in our universe, even if it comes from another dimension, would still by definition be an animal. And I think this is an important perspective because when we start to excessively spiritualize the phenomenon, we start to give it qualities that it doesn't necessarily deserve, like perfection, omnipotence, or altruism. We start getting very black and white in our thinking about the phenomenon when we, in my view, when we excessively assume that it's just a spiritually advanced entity. It might just be animals like we are that have been around longer than we have. It really might be that mundane. And all of the spiritual components of UFO history may be the result of a combination of a lot of highly advanced technology, and in some capacity, sure, some of it may be that their psychic abilities have evolved further than ours, but this would not discount them being animals. So I want to continue with the theme of pushing back against UFO culture echo chamber, which isn't to suggest that what I'm pushing back against is an opinion that is accepted by everybody. But it is an opinion that I perceive is highly prevalent and deserves to be pushed back against. And this video builds off my previous video. One of the claims David Grush made is that there's a chance that the US government has made an agreement with non-human intelligence. He didn't seem to go so far to say that that's a guaranteed truth, but he was looking into it and wanted to get more information on that potentiality. Whistleblower former Colonel Carl Nell has also broached the idea that there's a potential that the US government has made an agreement with non-human intelligence. Now, the reason this possibility is so important when we talk about UFO culture echo chamber is it strongly contradicts the idea that UFO intelligence is all love and light. If UFO intelligence was all love and light, then would they engage in something so manipulative as making a secret agreement with the US government without telling or involving our elected officials and the rest of the world? It's this kind of contemplation that evokes my emphasis that we need to be spiritually and psychologically mature as we transition into a post-disclosure world. And I would argue that that spiritual and psychological maturity is not aligned with making assumptions about the phenomenon as gospel when we don't have enough data to do so. To me, that's an immature way to approach the phenomenon. And I don't think this kind of perspective would ever become popular amongst all 8 billion of us. As I said in my last video, the UFO community is an artificial construct. It could not exist without the cover-up. If there was no cover-up, we would have the opinions of our institutions, our theologians, our scientists, our sociologists, and all 8 billion of us contributing to the conversation. But unfortunately, because there's been a cover-up, not just from the United States, but multiple nations, allegedly, and I believe it's true, our conversation about the phenomenon has become so insular that people discuss the phenomenon with undeserved authority. And I'm calling that out as a mistake. I don't think it's justified. I don't think it's a mature way, spiritually or psychologically, to approach this enigma. I think it's a very kind of, it's bordering on religiosity-like thinking. And so that's why in this video, I wanted to discuss the potential that the US government has made an agreement with non-human intelligence. Because if that's true, then obviously, at least from my perspective, some of the non-human intelligence isn't this righteous, spiritual, transcendent source that some people make it out to be. Unless you can somehow argue that covertly making an agreement with the US government that has lasted for decades and contributed to the cover-up is somehow aligned with love and light. In fairness, maybe that agreement will end up benefiting humanity in the long run. Maybe the non-human intelligence was manipulating the US government in just the right way so that when the truth finally comes out, our world will evolve in a way that it otherwise wouldn't have. Yes, that's a possibility, but it's also a possibility that whatever allegedly made an agreement with the US government is just has their own self-interest and selfishness and objectives. And they didn't care that it's problematic to make an agreement with the US government, or they didn't understand that it's problematic to make an agreement with the United States government. So this is my attempt to push back against UFO culture echo chamber. Because in my view, the proposition that the US government made an agreement with non-human intelligence absolutely contradicts the attempt to portray non-human intelligence as these angelic beings. No, they're not so angelic if they've made a darn agreement with the US government. And that's just my perspective. And maybe that's, you know, let's go further with this, frankly. Maybe that's why the men in black, if you will, or men in suits, call them what you will, are so aggressive and have been so aggressive. Maybe that's one of the reasons the US government is so paranoid about this secret coming out, because they made agreements with non-human intelligence to make efforts to suppress the truth. Have you ever considered that as a possibility, or does it contradict your assumptions so strongly that you're not willing to entertain other possibilities? And that's what I'm saying. We must overcome the temptation to commit to one perspective about the phenomenon. There are so many possibilities. We don't have enough data. And so when these gurus come onto the scene and try to tell you what the truth is, I would urge you to have a little bit of skepticism and to recognize that it's very plausible that they don't have all the answers, that nobody has all the answers. We are dealing with higher intelligences that are so much further advanced than us that they can easily give us one impression while another impression might be true. Well, why would you not entertain that? I do not understand. I absolutely entertain the idea that the manipulation, because I think there has to be some kind of manipulation. I mean, they're engaging our world covertly without informing us officially. That's not manipulative. I don't know. I think it kind of is on some level. I'm absolutely open to the idea that ultimately the way that they are engaging our world will work out in our favor in the end. But I'm also very open to it being much more complicated, less black and white, and there is some inherent selfishness and self-interest that really has nothing to do with influencing our world in a positive direction. I'm open to a lot of possibilities, and that's what I'm trying to encourage with people interested in this topic, is not to get bogged down in dogma. This is too complicated and too profound to get bogged down in dogma. The degree of nuance the post-disclosure world is going to have is likely far beyond your imagination. And a big reason of that is because you've been, as I have been, in a UFO culture echo chamber, which discourages, in my opinion, nuanced thinking, because it gives people authority that they do not deserve. And then they give us their take on the phenomenon, and we start to have a narrow view of the phenomenon based upon their perspective. The full conversation has been curtailed and circumvented by governments covering it up, obfuscating, stigmatizing the topic. So I'm trying to undo the damage that has been done. So the nuance is mind-blowing, and I'm going to share a couple tweets with you that I had with some other people that really goes into the deep, profound complexity and nuance that this topic demands us to take into consideration. On August 31st, I wrote, "If you think the United States Air Force wants to create an alien threat narrative to increase military spending, then you don't know what you're talking about. They want the cover-up to continue for eternity. They don't want to take accountability for the lies and obfuscation." Othello responded, "Correct. Let's shift the conversation, though. I know you're a reasonable man. Why not start pushing for a movement that demands transparency from the non-human intelligence?" To which I responded, "It's an interesting idea for sure, worthy of strong consideration. This makes me consider why governments may be apprehensive about disclosure. They may fear, reasonably I may argue, that disclosure will elicit open contact. If the phenomenon has a manipulative streak, governments may conclude that open direct communication makes humanity more susceptible to their manipulation. Much contemplation of this I will." And so this conversation helped me to think about one of the reasons governments may be so apprehensive about UFO transparency. And this is a consideration that I don't think I've given adequate contemplation to. Think about it from a government's perspective. You have all this data of UFOs, non-human intelligence, engaging our world. There's this Cold War sub rosa occurring where adversaries are all attempting to recover as many of these craft as possible to back engineer them. And you know that some of these craft are landing intentionally so that you can collect them. That's at least according to David Grush and others. That it's not just crashed vehicles or shot down vehicles. It's more nuanced and more complex than that. Allegedly, some of these craft are landing intentionally, presumably because they want to be, because the intelligence behind it wants governments to collect it. We're dealing with a cosmic chessboard of the highest degree. And so governments have an intimate understanding of how weird this whole thing is and how, in many ways, unnerving it is. They have a viewpoint, vantage point that we do not have. We have the luxury of getting on Twitter and oversimplifying the whole situation. We're not responsible for national security. We're not responsible for enacting decisions that could change theoretically could change the whole relationship that all 8 billion of us have with the phenomenon. So it's very easy for us to oversimplify it and get really angry at governments. I'm not suggesting that governments are not in the wrong for covering it up. I absolutely believe that they are. All I'm saying is it's not as simple as we often make it out to be. One of the reasons they may not want transparency is because they know how weird this phenomenon is. It has an agenda. It has a will. It's doing things that don't make sense to us, such as I mentioned earlier, landing craft, abandoning those craft, knowing they're going to be collected by governments, knowing those governments are going to attempt to back engineer them. Meanwhile, I don't know how much covert communication governments have with this phenomenon, if any, and the communication they may have may be very manipulative. It may be predicated on agreements that were made decades ago. You can understand why governments may be highly reluctant to be transparent on this topic if they consider that transparency could elicit open contact, and they may perceive that this phenomenon is not really to be trusted. Now they're going to tell the world about this phenomenon that could lead to open contact. Open contact, at least theoretically, could lead to a different kind of manipulation, one that is more direct and possibly more pervasive, where the methods of influence could shift from subtle, behind-the-scenes actions to overt, widespread interventions, fundamentally altering how these interactions occur. So from that vantage point, I can understand why governments may just want to play it safe. And for them, playing it safe is continuing to lie and obfuscate, because they don't know if the relationship between humanity and the phenomenon could shift as a result of transparency. I'm just trying to broaden the conversation and influence everyone to be open to more possibilities. And for anyone who would say, well, why aren't you open to more possibilities? I would say I absolutely am. If you go to my YouTube channel, I only have, I think at this point, I only have one playlist, and it's about my alien AI hypothesis, which is very optimistic and casts non-human intelligence in a positive light. So I don't know how anyone could say that I'm not open to other possibilities. I'm not trying to persuade people where they should lean. That's your discretion. What I am trying to persuade you to is that no matter where you lean in how you perceive the phenomenon, you should still simultaneously be open to other possibilities. When you begin to negate those other possibilities, now you're entering the realm of dogma. Furthermore, it's pretty hard to be completely optimistic about the phenomenon, in my view, considering the level of complexity. There are a lot of concerns that seem impossible to ignore. And the post-disclosure world is going to be very different, in my view. It's going to be very different than the pre-disclosure world. The UFO community is no longer going to have the influence it once did. We're no longer going to be this insular group. And we're no longer going to be as prone to giving certain people authority on this topic that maybe they don't deserve. Maybe it's too big of a mystery to give any one person so much authority of this enigma. Now you could argue, well, but what about Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and da-da-da-da? Yeah, but Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon are very clear that we need more data. They're not giving you answers. They're giving you their ideas, but caveating that with that we need more data and we don't know exactly what's going on. That's very different from UFO gurus who don't give you that caveat, who don't say, well, here's my perspective, but it could be otherwise. They don't do that, and that's a problem. And that's not part of the spirit of a post-disclosure world, in my opinion. So I suspect I will get pushback from this, and I will push back to the pushback, because I do recall multiple quotes from Lou's book where he talks about needing more data and not being committed to any particular position in terms of whether UFO intelligence is an overriding threat or not. But I'm going to just share a quick quote for you that I think is so important, because I am totally cool with anybody's opinion. The only thing that I find troubling is when people say their opinion is fact, when we might be dealing with as many as 20 species of non-human intelligences, just as an example. So how is anyone going to say they're all peaceful, they're all loving, they're all love and light? I agree they're not sinking battleships or dropping bombs, but that doesn't mean they're completely devoid of causing human beings issues necessarily. It doesn't mean that the way they've behaved in the past is necessarily how they will behave in the future. I'm not a fan of assumptions or characterizing this phenomenon as a particular way, as if it's fact, I think it's a big problem. And I don't think it's the spirit of a post-disclosure world. I think it's the spirit of a pre-disclosure world. Anyways, here's the quote I want to share from Lou's book. And I quote, "I wondered about the character of these so-called visitors, our friends from out of town, as I had when we tried to understand their interest in nuclear sites. What made them tick? I could see only 3 scenarios. 1, the visitors are benevolent and don't want to interfere with our existence. They just want to continue using Earth as a galactic way station for natural resources, or possibly they're so benevolent that they hope to save us from ourselves. 2, they're malevolent. They are here to take from us and will show up in vast numbers in the future. 3, they're neutral. Like humans, they can do both good and bad, and they hope to observe and learn from us." So those are the 3 basic potentialities as Lou understands it in terms of what our friends from out of town are like. And I think people are entitled to lean toward any of those perspectives. What I don't think people are entitled to do is say that any particular perspective is fact. Because we cannot ascertain what their true agenda or intentions are. We can only give our best perspective on it based upon the limited amount of data that we have. And so I think that's important. And I would say that anyone that comes out and tells you that they know the truth about non-human intelligence, whether it's all bad or it's all good or it's definitely neutral, they're not basing that on absolute fact. They're basing that on their opinion. And if you can't understand that, then I just don't know what to tell you. But all of this tendency of some people to tell you what's going on like it's fact, that's a pre-disclosure world. That's not a post-disclosure world. That stuff will not really resonate with people or survive scrutiny in a post-disclosure world because it's so groundless. You can't tell people what we're dealing with when what we're dealing with is a mystery. That doesn't make any sense. Please do not forget to subscribe. If you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my merch shop where I sell t-shirts. You could become a patron. You could become a YouTube member. You could give me a one-time donation. All those potentialities can be accessed in the description box below, or you can just slap a like on this bad boy, and I will appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.